From the Toronto Star, I'm Raji Mudder, and this matters. Generation X's vaccine hangover is lasting longer than expected. A few weeks ago, there were plenty of 40-plus-year-olds in Ontario celebrating with vaccine selfies, proudly proclaiming being on Team AstraZeneca. But now, due to legitimate health concerns about potential blood clots combined with a dose of confusing messaging from health experts, there are many who are feeling what can best be described as a form of vaccine buyer's remorse. There are also issues surrounding AstraZeneca supply and questions about what happens with the required second doses. Alex Boyd is a Calgary-based reporter for The Star who has been covering vaccines for much of the pandemic. She's been on the show a number of times and this time joins us to discuss the latest news about the AstraZeneca vaccine. Alex, thank you so much for making the time to join us.
Good to be back. Thank you.
Okay, Alex, we have to talk about the saga of AstraZeneca. This really is the vaccine whose story has taken on a life of its own. Let's talk the latest.
Yes, AstraZeneca, more than really any of the other vaccines, has really been on a bit of a journey. To rewind back to last year, it was developed by Oxford University. It was one of the early front runners. It was meant to be easy to distribute. It was meant to be cheap. It was really going to be the vaccine that was going to save the world. And now, a year later, we've had issues with data. We've had issues with trial results. And now the most recent thing is this issue with a very rare blood clot. And so we've known that this has been an issue before. We've seen reports out of the UK. We've seen issues in Europe. But now it's come back to Ontario. There's been enough data now of these cases. So what has changed this week is we've seen a slight uptick in the incidence of these sorts of blood clots occurring in Ontario. Before, we thought the risk was about 1 in 100,000. Now it's slightly more. It's about 1 in 60,000. So while public health officials have really stressed this is still a pretty small risk, it's enough that it has triggered the monitoring system that we've put in place to track these sorts of side effects. And so what they're really doing is they're hitting the pause button and saying, we want to take a little bit of time to figure out what's going on here. We'll be back with some advice later. But I think a lot of people right now are feeling a little bit of confusion. Some people maybe a little bit of buyer's remorse. And we'll get into the reasons, obviously, of why, I think there is a lot of hope here. This isn't necessarily, a sign that the AstraZeneca vaccine is not a good vaccine to be taking. But at the same time, this is kind of the latest incident and a lot of confusing updates. And so I think, a lot of people are feeling that it's a little bit murky, and I get that.
So the news is it's paused in Ontario, and I want to use the official term for these blood clots, which I'm probably going to stumble over. These are called VIT, or vaccine-induced immune thrombotic thrombocytopenia. I think I may have gotten that. It is one of these things. 3 people have actually died because of this, or post taking the AstraZeneca thing. But, while the odds have increased of this potential side effect, these clots are extremely rare. They are treatable. And if you are someone who was in sort of the first wave of the AZ Ontario, which I am, I got it the first day that the 40-year-olds was available. If you haven't felt anything, you're fine, right? They would have probably showed up by now, right? I'm just trying to be reassuring about how rare this actually is.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, we do need to acknowledge that, like you say, 3 people have died, 3 families are mourning people right now, and that's not nothing. But at the same time, 2 million or slightly more than 2 million doses have been distributed here in Canada. And, of those, 12 people have gotten sick. So it is considered to be quite rare. And so the risk window is from about 4 days to about 28 days is what they're thinking. So if you're still in that window, continue to monitor for symptoms. So things like a really severe headache, double vision, changes to your limbs, whether they're cold or look kind of pale. And so if you are concerned, consult a doctor, talk to a medical expert, because if it is caught early, it is very treatable. So that there are signs of hope here. It can obviously, be serious and sometimes fatal, but it is still considered a very, very rare medical risk. And particularly when you compare it to, some of the risks of COVID, we need to look at this in terms of the larger context here. Rates are still relatively high. We know that COVID is a dangerous disease. And so, it's something to kind of, look at within the context of the larger risk here.
The AstraZeneca vaccine is also paused in Alberta, but for different reasons, right? That's a supply issue. Can you explain those to us?
Yeah, exactly. So we heard that from Alberta yesterday as well, that they are going to be pausing AstraZeneca for first doses. But at this point, the justification that they're giving for that is that we don't have a ton of supply. And so they're going to be holding back what they have for second doses. And so, one of the big pieces of this puzzle right now is that Canada doesn't have a lot of AstraZeneca right now. And so we've heard from the feds that we'll likely be getting more in June, but it's still kind of murky. We don't know when, we don't know how much. Obviously, one of the big issues here is that India, which is one of the biggest vaccine producers in the world, has been tasked with making a lot of the AstraZeneca. But because they're dealing with what is, a pretty horrific outbreak, they've restricted exports so that they can get those vaccines to their own people to try to get that under control.
I think a lot of the confusion and betrayal surrounds the change in messaging from get the first vaccine offered to now, thanks to Nachi, that there is a preferred vaccine. What did you think about the communications breakdown from the past week and how that may be contributing to vaccine hesitancy?
Yeah, that is a tough one. I think we've all learned this week while professional communicators are a thing. I think the communication has not been fantastic. I think it's been uneven. I think it's been unclear. To give credit where it's due, if you've got the time in your day to sit through, the hour and a half NACI presser or to sit through the Ontario press conference from yesterday, which I think was also about 40 minutes, then, there is some nuance there. I think they really are trying to kind of explain the risks here. But I think most people don't really have that kind of time. And so, when you're pausing this, when you're constantly changing the age limits, that is really confusing for people. I also think using language like preferred vaccine is also something that, I think is going to spook the horses, I think, as they say. So I think it's totally fair that people are feeling a little bit confused right now. I think on the other side of the coin, this is a very tough job. I was talking to Dr. Lenora Saxinger, who's an infectious disease expert at the University of Alberta a couple of weeks ago. And she was saying, medical risk communication is not like a magical thing. It is something that people study. You can read academic journals about how to communicate risk to people in a way that they understand it. But some of those principles, which are things like making sure that you use consistent numbers or, making sure that you kind of talk about the risk and the benefit, are hard to achieve right now when the numbers are constantly changing. And so I think it is fair to acknowledge that, public health communicators are in a really tough position right now because, things are always kind of evolving and people see that as the public, scientific process not working when in fact, we're just gathering data as we go. Initially we only knew about the public health trials. Then we got a little bit more information from the UK and from other countries. Now we're actually getting data from what's going on in Canada itself. And so, we're just kind of learning as we go along. We're updating our numbers. And so that's what's happening, though I think it is often perceived as, people being wishy-washy or changing their minds. The other element that I think is maybe getting lost here a little bit is it can change depending on whether you're thinking about this as an individual or if you're looking at this as a member of a group. And so, obviously, if you're the person rolling up your sleeve, you just want to know, is this safe or is this not safe? But as we're learning, doctors and public health officials don't necessarily think that way. As they've said, no vaccine, no medicine is really inherently safe or not safe. Really, what you have to look at is the larger risk calculation. So looking at things like, what is my risk of COVID? How bad is the virus that is circulating? Are there other options around that may mean that one of these vaccines is preferable to the one that I'm being offered? And so they're kind of looking at the big picture and trying to make some sort of decision. So again, if you're looking at the tree or if you're looking at the forest, those can sometimes lead to different conclusions. And so that's what's happening here is that, individually, it might make sense to take AstraZeneca. It might still make sense to take AstraZeneca. But if you look at kind of what's happening in the population, they got this safety signal and now they have a duty to figure out what it is. But again, I think the context is really important here. To go back to India, they're really reliant on AstraZeneca. They're not having conversations about blood clots because their outbreak is so bad right now. They're not worried about that. It is very much a life and death situation in many cases for them to get the vaccine out. And so again, in some ways that we are able to pause the rollout, to look at other vaccines, to have these conversations is a sign of the fact that we've got lots of vaccines and we're starting to get our cases under control. So our context is preferable to a place like India.
We'll be right back. I hate to say this, but, we are really talking about a first world problem. right here. And the other thing too is I believe the UK, AstraZeneca was the majority of doses there, and that was one of the fastest countries to get vaccinated. Now, the thing is, right now, all eyes are on the UK because there's been plenty of discussions about mixing and matching vaccines, which most experts think might potentially give us more varied immunity. But we're basically, everyone in the world is waiting on a big study happening at Oxford right now. And I believe that there's news expected very soon out of this, right?
It is, yeah. That is a trial that I know federal officials are watching very closely because it could be a real game changer for how we distribute vaccines in this country. So basically what they're looking at is if instead of getting two vaccines that are the same company, so right now, if you get Moderna, you got to stick with Moderna. If you get AstraZeneca, you got to stick with AstraZeneca. So what this is trialing is it possible for you to get, one vaccine that's AstraZeneca, for example, and then follow up with a Pfizer, a few weeks later. And so obviously from a distribution perspective, this would make all of our lives a lot easier. If they can just go to the fridge and grab whatever vaccine they have and just give it to you, this is going to make the logistical challenge of getting vaccines out a lot easier. But the other thing here as well is that obviously, if you've had your first AstraZeneca shot and you're now mulling, what do I want to be doing for my second shot? And to be clear, Ontario is going to be coming out with more guidance. They say they're going to be advising the public, before that time rolls around for second doses. So there will be more information that they're coming out with. But that is one of the options that they're looking at is if this mix and match trial turns out to work, then maybe you could get, a Pfizer or a Moderna for your second dose. We're not totally sure yet. But of course, as you mentioned, one of the potentials here is that if you have two different vaccines, you could actually potentially, again, we don't know this, but you could potentially end up with a better immune response because the different types of vaccines actually stimulate a different type of your immune system. So without going, too much into the weeds here, it's kind of like teaching your immune system karate versus judo or something. So to take two different vaccines, you could actually end up with two different ways of fighting off the virus. So there's a lot of potential to this study. We don't know yet, but we are expecting results relatively soon.
So Alex, the other thing is we're basically on a wait and see approach on second doses, right?
Basically, yeah. Ontario, they're taking this time to go back to the drawing board, look at all the information, look at what's happening in the UK, and then they're going to be coming out with new recommendations. I think the other thing that's probably worth noting is one thing that we know from the UK is that if you're going to get a blood clot from AstraZeneca, it is very, very likely that you will get it after the first and not after the second. And so the chances of getting this sort of clot after the second dose could be as low as 1 in a million. So again, people are a little bit wary, but there is considerable evidence that your risk is highest for the first dose. So that's, again, another thing that they're considering, but they will be coming out with some sort of recommendation about whether or not it should be a second AstraZeneca dose, whether it should be another vaccine. But right now, they're just kind of looking at the numbers, doing the thing that scientific experts do, and we will be hearing more from them soon.
I want to talk a little bit about vaccine culture. I mean, one of the things that we saw was Gen X getting off their butts and making a big deal about getting their vaccine selfies. And now I think it's one of these things that they're feeling a little bit of that vaccine buyer's remorse. What do you think about that? I think it's a little bit silly. The thing that they should remember is this is an incredibly effective vaccine, right?
It really is. I think if you were to tell people that you had this vaccine this time last year, there'd probably be riots in the streets of people wanting to get it. One of the last pieces of evidence I saw out of the UK, I was reading this morning, was that even just one shot of AstraZeneca, they say could reduce your chances of death from COVID for up to 80%. And so, if you can think back to what, some of the worst waves of this pandemic, if you were to tell people that that was available, if you had to have a small risk of blood clot, I don't think this would be the same conversation. So, I think it is a point of privilege, I guess, that we have so many vaccines that we can start trying to rank them and kind of decide, which the best one is. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of positivity here. I think, a lot of people are learning about vaccines. I think, we tend to focus on the stereotypical anti-vaxxer, but, if my emails are any reflection or the people that tweeted me are any reflection, a lot of people just kind of want to know. They just want to learn. I had a friend call me the other night at 11 o'clock. She was just desperate to talk about the latest Lancet study on vaccine efficacy. And we had a good laugh because who knew this was going to be the conversation we were all having in 2021. So I think a lot of this is people just really want to know. And we're all kind of on this learning journey together. This is a decision that, we all have to make individually. And I think a lot of people, though, are approaching this with good faith. They just want to know. And I think there's a lot of positives to that.
Let's talk about the story that you're working on today. And this is about the fact that the Canadian vaccine rate is actually about to overtake the US, right? Can we actually say that part of this might have been from the bump of all of the Gen X people going to get their AstraZeneca? So explain what's happening. And then, is this part of this?
Yes. And so this is, part of why I think people who took AstraZeneca should feel good about it. Not only are they themselves more protected, their families are more protected. They are a big contributor to what we're seeing in Canada, which is a major uptick in our vaccination rate. And so we actually saw the daily vaccination rate pass the US. It was late last week. But now on a day-to-day basis, Canada is actually vaccinating a bigger proportion of their population than the United States, which is really positive. It's not an unqualified win. The US had a few weeks head start over us. So cumulatively, they've done more vaccinations than we have. It's also kind of indicative of the different stages that we're in, because obviously when you first start vaccinating, you have all these people who are super excited, but then the US has kind of moved through all those people and are now starting to work on people who are a little bit more hesitant. So it's kind of natural to see that their rates slow down while ours is still in a growth phase. But at the same time, considering for a lot of this pandemic, we didn't think we were going to get vaccines, until 2022, or we didn't know when we were going to get enough of them. The fact that we have enough vaccines to be vaccinating at the pace that we are, I think is a really positive part of this story. And people who took AstraZeneca and, showed up in droves, I remember the pictures of people being real excited to be out there and to get that vaccine. I think they should feel happy that they were part of that. Again, I don't want to belittle the concerns around risk here. But, to be protected and to be part of kind of this wave of helping to protect the community, I think that's really good news.
I completely agree. I felt nothing but relief when I got my shot. And right now I'm waiting to hear about the rest. But I'm telling you, I feel a heck of a lot better than before I was vaccinated or I got my first dose. And everything I read tells me that I should be very happy. And it's one of those things, I'm going to ask you my general closing question, which is there anything that I didn't ask that you think our listeners should know? But I will note, I think the last 2 times that you've come on, the one thing that you've reminded people is how many people in the rest of the world are still waiting for their vaccinations. Anyways, I open the floor to you, Alex. What do you think that our listeners should know?
I'm not sure if that was a nudge for me to talk about something else, but yes, I'm a broken record, but I do think that is a really important story that people should be paying attention to. We're now at a state here in Canada where we're vaccinating 12-year-olds, and that's great. That's really fantastic news. But, we've got 12-year-olds in this country who are getting vaccines ahead of doctors and nurses in a lot of other countries. And so, again, I think we're approaching a point where, the fact that the rest of the world is not vaccinated is going to be a growing issue. There is an update from last time. We've seen a little bit of warmth from Canada to support what's called the TRIPS waiver, which would basically do away with intellectual property for a lot of these vaccines. The reason that's important is it would allow more places in the world to manufacture, essentially, it's kind of like generic versions of these vaccines and could potentially get more supply out to the rest of the world. The US came out and said they're supporting it. Canada's been lukewarm, but because the US went first, it seems like they might be rethinking their stance. But that is something concrete to watch if this is an issue that you're interested in.
Alex, I really want to thank you for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
Alex Boyd is a Calgary-based reporter for The Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Rajin Budler, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisaz. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.